favorite things about studying poetry is that you get to meet writers who lived in very different times than you, lived a very different life than you, and you get to see this crystallization of their genius and their perspective in their poetry, and you get invited into their thought. And sonnets have a way of inviting us into the thought of poets in really powerful and potent and concentrated ways. So I want to tell you a bit about this poet that I just discovered a few weeks ago named Charlotte Smith. Now, Charlotte Smith isn't a new writer. Charlotte Smith wrote in the late 1700s. But she's a poet who's been mostly forgotten, especially in literature survey courses. You know, when you only have so much time to read the history of literature, you kind of focus on the most major writers, especially the writers who had an impact on big literary movements. So when we think about the 1780s and 90s and we study them in like British literature class, usually we focus on three men: William Blake, William Wordsworth, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. William Blake published a series of collections that were wild and interesting, you know, Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forests of the Night, in the late 1700s. In 1798, right at the cusp of the turn of the century, we get Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads, which gives both of them fame and leads to a long career, especially for William Wordsworth, in which he wrote a lot of sonnets. He wrote these poems and became famous for kind of spearheading what's called the Romantic movement in England. Charlotte Smith was writing at the same time as William Wordsworth, but she published a little before him. In 1784, she published a collection called Elegiac Sonnets, which is a long collection of sonnets. I believe there are a few dozen. It's very worth looking through. You can find it, on public domain. But this has been largely forgotten, looked over in this sort of big picture literary survey sense of the way we study literature today. But if you look back, Charlotte Smith was actually kind of a hit in the 1780s and 90s and arguably repopularized the sonnet to the point that Wordsworth could write sonnets and be praised for them because they were made in vogue again by Charlotte Smith. Now, here's an interesting thing about Charlotte Smith. She wasn't just, a nice aristocratic lady penning sonnets in her spare time. Charlotte Smith had been a writer since her youth. She was very talented. She ended up being betrothed and married to a man she didn't really know well, and turns out was kind of rotten. This man squandered all their money and ended up in debtor's prison. Smith, not knowing what else to do, but knowing she had a talent, moved to prison with him. Apparently, she didn't need to live with him in prison because he was the one who was in debt. She moved voluntarily into prison with him and wrote sonnets in prison and sent them out for publication and ended up collecting them into this book, which made enough money for her family to basically be free of debtor's prison. She literally wrote her way out of prison. This is a desperate situation. This is very different than most other poets. William Wordsworth, for example, he was a man of some means. He got to live in the Lake District. He wasn't poor and destitute writing his way out of prison. Charlotte Smith was. And it gives, I think, a context and an urgency and just a uniqueness to her perspective and her approach to writing sonnets. So I want to show you a poem of Charlotte Smith that is kind of about the difficulties of writing and of living as a human. This is called "The Partial Muse Has From My Earliest Hours." That's the first line of it. The partial muse has from my earliest hours smiled on the rugged path I'm doomed to tread, and still with sportive hand has snatched wild flowers to weave fantastic garlands for my head. But far, far happier is the lot of those who never learned her dear delusive art, which, while it decks the head with many a rose, reserves the thorn to fester in the heart. For still she bids soft pity's melting eye stream o'er the ills she knows not to remove, points every pang and deepens every sigh of mourning friendship or unhappy love. Ah, then, how dear the muse's favors cost, if those paint sorrow best who feel it most. This is a English sonnet. It has an A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G rhyme scheme. So this is following the tradition of Shakespeare. And it's about one of the sonneteer's favorite subjects, the muse. The partial muse has from my earliest hours smiled on the rugged path I'm doomed to tread. Now, partial is an interesting word here. I think when we first encountered this word, at least when I first encountered this word, I was thinking, oh, like this muse that maybe only can partially help. But I don't think that's what's going on. This is the partial muse, the muse that plays favorites, the muse that is partial to some and not to others. The muse that maybe is partial to you for some time and then withdraws her favors. Someone who's writing in a desperate situation and yet knows that she has genius within her. Perhaps is more acutely aware of the partiality of the muse than others. The partial muse has from my earliest hours smiled on the rugged path I'm doomed to tread, and still with sportive hand has snatched wild flowers to weave fantastic garlands for my head. She knows she's favored of the muse. The partial muse has smiled on her, and yet her path is rugged. Far, far happier. So she's now contrasting another type of person with the type that she is. Far, far happier is the lot of those who never learned her dear delusive art, which, while it decks the head with many a rose, resorbs the thorn to fester in the heart. Maybe it would be better for those who weren't favored by her, especially if it meant they didn't have to suffer. If I get a head of roses, I have a heart of thorns. You know, this is a very classic image going all the way back to the medieval era that, you know, the beauty of the rose is proportional to the danger and pain of the thorn that guards it. So the first 8 lines, the octave, as we've called it, is this kind of comparison in 4 lines of the state she's in. The partial muse has favored me, but my life has been hard. Maybe it would be better to not be favored by the muse, but not to have a hard life. But then we round into the sestet. For still she bids soft pity's melting eye stream o'er the ills she knows not to remove, points every pang and deepens every sigh of mourning friendship or unhappy love. This unhappy love, I think, is very poignant here, knowing she's with this man who is kind of her ruin, and yet she loves him, and she's doing something that is, I think, when we look back in history, very admirable and very unique. So it's not just that, you know, I've had kind of a hard road, but the muse smiles on me. It's the muse is kind of increasing the pain. She knows not to remove the ills. She knows to leave those ills in me in order to bless me more. Deepens every sigh, points every pang. This is perhaps an instance of maybe resentment of the muse, or accusation of the muse at the very least. Ah, then how dear the muse's favor cost, if those paint sorrow best who feel it most. So this is sort of a summing up couplet. It costs a lot to be favored of the muse. I can paint sorrow best because I felt it most. This is a rather simple argument overall. It's not too complex, but I think we can see that the sonnet looks at it in 3 different ways. First, in the first 8 lines, we have this comparison of favored of the muse means you're going to have a hard life. Maybe it would be better to not be favored and not have a hard life. And then oh yeah, and it's not just that the muse favors those who have a hard life. It's she increases it. She knows not to let us go. And then in this final couplet, this has allowed me to paint sorrow best. I paint it better than others. You know, there's almost this kind of humble brag here. I feel the pain most, thus I can paint it best. There's sort of 3 perspectives, three approaches to this muse, misery, concoction, connection, proportion. The first is in 8 lines, which is pretty chatty. It's pretty casual. The next is in 4 lines that's a little more dense. And then it's this kind of concentrated 2-line couplet, which kind of pushes everything that we've seen in the first 8 and the next 4 into this kind of sort of crystalline rhyming 2. Charlotte Smith is a great practitioner of the sonnet. Go check out Elegiac Sonnets, which she published in the 1790s. And discover a poet who you've probably never heard of before. I know I hadn't heard of her until a few weeks ago. And discover the poetry that maybe we missed along the way that deserves recovery.